referred to me as the kelp lady when I walked in today, which was, I wasn't aware that that was going to be my designation, but I kind of like it, crazy kelp lady. I can see myself growing old as that. But anyways, yes, I'm Sara Hamilton. It's nice to be here today. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University. I'm in the Department of Integrative Biology and co-advised by Bruce Mingy and Kirsten Grow-Reed-Colbert. And I study rocky reef ecosystems off the coast of Oregon here. One of the aspects of my PhD, one of the big focuses, is using satellite imagery to track kelp populations along the Oregon coast. And since I did this work, I'm doing this work, and since I'm one of the only people in Oregon doing work like this, Bob asked me to come here and give a talk today about why we should be talking about kelp at a sea otter symposium, what we currently know about kelp in Oregon, and what it is we have left to learn. So with that in mind, why are we talking about kelp at a sea otter symposium? Well, I think it's been made pretty clear today, and a lot of us probably already knew, that kelp is an important habitat for otters. Otters are often found associating with kelp forests. At this point, I want to make a distinction. When I'm talking about kelp in this presentation, I'm talking specifically about canopy-forming kelp. Canopy-forming kelp are species of kelp that grow from the bottom of the ocean all the way up to the surface, and then their blades spread out along the surface, as you can see with this otter frolicking in the blades of giant kelp. And I'm talking about canopy-forming kelp specifically because that's what I study. That's what we have the best information on here in Oregon. And also, otters are oftentimes found closely associated with specifically canopy-forming kelp forests. So we care about kelp because it's important habitat for otters. But there are so many other reasons that we should be talking about kelp. Let me get started. So of course, one of the primary functions is as habitat, not just for otters, but the holdfast, the stipe, the blades, all provide substrate that little critters can come and settle on. Additionally, other free-swimming critters like juvenile fish or mysids or zooplankton like to come hide in the blades from predators. And then bigger animals come to feed on those critters, and you get these vibrant ecosystems popping up around the kelp. Another important function that kelp forests play is as a direct food source, the most famous of which is for urchins. Kelp also influence not only the ecosystems they are directly part of, but systems around them, oftentimes as nutrient subsidies, such as when kelp will dislodge and wash up onto beaches as wrack. You've probably seen it washed up on the beaches. And there it will, as it decomposes, it releases nutrients that have been shown to help fertilize dune grasses and dune beach ecosystems. Furthermore, the kelp can also dislodge, and instead of washing up on the beach, it can sink down to deep sea environments, which are oftentimes food and nutrient limited because they're aphotic. They don't have access to light. And there it can become food or other kinds of resources for things like deep sea urchins. Another important aspect of the habitat function that I want to point out is that kelp forests are really important for the recruitment of a lot of juvenile fish. And one of the most notable examples is rockfish. Down in California, there are certain species of rockfish that their juveniles, pretty much the only nursery habitat for them is kelp. We have plenty of species of rockfish here in Oregon, rockfish, lingcod, other kinds of fish whose juveniles are often found very densely in the kelp forests. A service that they can provide to humans is that since kelp forests oftentimes form in these kind of dense mats right off the coast, they take a lot of beating from storms and from waves. And in that function, they help protect our shorelines from erosion. The final thing to point out is that, as I mentioned with kind of how they support rockfish populations, kelp forests help support many different kinds of fisheries. Here in Oregon, they help support fisheries such as the rockfish and lingcod, both commercial and recreational fisheries, but they also directly support urchin fisheries, of which we have a small one here in Oregon, and there are much larger ones elsewhere, such as in California. And I could keep going. There's so many amazing things that I could tell you about kelp, but the point is that it's a really cool part of coastal ecosystems, and these are some of the reasons that we should be thinking about it beyond just otters. So let's talk a little bit about canopy-forming kelp and the kinds that we see along the US West Coast. Now this is the kelp that everyone thinks about. It's giant kelp. It's found in these big, beautiful beds, especially in central and southern California. You see it whenever there are documentaries about kelp. It's always about the giant kelp forests of Southern California. I'm not bitter. And it's really well researched. There's been a lot of work done in Central California, Southern California, and Alaska about these giant kelp ecosystems. And therefore, it's one of the best studied marine ecosystems that we have on the planet. As you move north of Central California, though, another dominant canopy-forming kelp begins to emerge, and that's bull kelp. That's what we have primarily here in Oregon. We have a few small populations of Macrocystis in the Cape Arago region, but other than that, all our canopy-forming kelp is bull kelp. And bull kelp is a lot less understood than giant kelp. There's been a lot less research into its physiology, its population dynamics, and the ecosystems associated with it than there has been for giant kelp. But a few things to keep in notice that are unique about bull kelp. First off are its growth form. So as you can see with giant kelp, giant kelp, its stipe grows up from the bottom. It has multiple air bladders along that stipe, and then the blades spread out throughout the water column. Whereas bull kelp grows straight from the bottom all the way up to the surface with a single air bladder, and the blades kind of float off of that single air bladder. Second thing to note is that bull kelp does really well in wavy environments. It can hold on to substrate when there's high wave action a lot better than other kinds of kelp can, and this gives it a competitive advantage. And then one final thing to note is that bull kelp is an annual species. It really traditionally only lives for 1 year, whereas giant kelp is a perennial species. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about bull kelp. I'm going to talk about its life cycle kind of briefly. So bull kelp, like a lot of forms of kelp, has a bipartite life cycle. That means it has two primary life stages, a gametophyte stage and a sporophyte stage. And I'm going to start by talking about the sporophytes first, because when you think of kelp, the big, beautiful algae growing up through the water column, that's what we're thinking of as a sporophyte. So starting in early spring, you can see kind of in the March, April-ish time, the baby sporophytes start growing from the substrate, and they just grow like gangbusters. Like it's some of the highest primary productivity in the oceans you'll find anywhere. So they grow really fast throughout the summer, and as they begin to hit the canopy and begin to mature, they start shedding what are called sori, these little patches of tissue. They shed them off of their blades, and these little patches contain gametophytes, which are the second stage of their life cycle, and I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so the sporophytes grow like gangbusters through the summer. Their canopy reaches a maximum in late summer or early fall. And then we come to the fall transition, which is when our relatively calm summer seas turn into our winter seas, and we get big storms and big waves. And these big waves actually do rip out most of the adult sporophyte populations. So within a month or so, when you're looking at this in satellite imagery, you'll go from seeing the most kelp that you'll see at any time in the year to almost nothing. It diminishes really quickly. So there's not much in the way of sporophyte population overwintering. But in this time, the gametophytes that have floated down from the blades and have lodged onto the substrate, they're going through their life cycle. And as they do that, they reproduce sexually and produce a brand new baby sporophyte, which if you've ever seen them, they're actually pretty cute. Not as cute as sea otters, but, and then the cycle starts again the next spring. So that's kind of some of the win of bull kelp. And now I'm going to zoom into bull kelp here in Oregon specifically. And talk about the where of bull kelp in Oregon. And what we know, some of what we know is that based on aerial surveys that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife did, mostly back in the 1990s. And what they found there was that there's very little of our kelp is concentrated in northern Oregon. And you can see in the smaller map to the left, that star, you can't see it all that well, but that's Newport, that's where we are right now. And in this area of the state, there's really not that much bull kelp. There are a few patches off of Depot Bay, Otter Rocks, areas like that. But really the vast majority of our big, beautiful, lush kelp forests are in southern Oregon. And you can see on the map to the right, what's in red are traditionally where some of the biggest kelp patches are. And you can see that those are concentrated around Cape Arago, the Port Orford area, Gold Beach, and then scattered in somewhat smaller patches along the southern coast as you head down towards California. So it's where we find kelp in Oregon, or where we've historically found it. So the next thing I want to kind of talk about is how do these populations change? And right now I just want to talk about short-term change. And one of the things we do know about bull kelp is that these populations change very quickly, very dramatically. So this is a satellite image. This is some preliminary work that I've been doing with satellite imagery. And this is 2 satellite images of Orford Reef, which is one of the biggest kelp beds in the state. It's located down off of Port Orford in southern Oregon. And just to orient you, in this satellite image, everything in green is water, everything in red is kelp, a little counterintuitive, and everything in white are small islands or rocky outcroppings. So you can see that in 1999 at Orford Reef, well, in 1999, everywhere in the state, that was one of our biggest years for bull kelp that we know of. You can see that the red takes up most of this frame, and it was just a huge year for those populations. And then 2 years later, at the exact same time of year, in the middle of September, you see almost nothing in terms of, you see so much less red in that second frame. And when you begin to quantify this and quantify how big those patches are, you find that in 2001, there was about 5% as much kelp in southern Oregon as there was 2 years earlier. So these populations change quickly and dramatically, which I think is something to keep in mind moving forward. So this is on the short term. We have, oh, and I do want to point out that this is one example from 1999 to 2001, but there are lots of other examples when you start looking at the satellite imagery. This is like a constant process for bull kelp. So this is short-term change on the order of just a couple years. What do we know about long-term trends in bull kelp here in Oregon? And the answer is we don't know much. ODF&W has taken about 5 aerial surveys over the past 20 years, and that's definitely not enough to give us a good idea of long-term whether these populations are stable, they're increasing, decreasing. But we do have a few clues. One of the things we know is that globally, kelp populations are declining. Kelp does better in chillier waters, and so as sea surface temperatures increase, kelp does less well physiologically. And a 2016 paper found that globally there's a small annual decline. But something to note about that in this map that you see here, in red you have areas or ecoregions where kelp cover is declining. In purple, areas where kelp cover is increasing. And there's a lot of dark red areas on the map, but there are plenty of purple areas as well. So while globally there's a decrease, kelp is responding, to specific local conditions and is also increasing in many areas. So that's something to keep in mind. Another clue we have to some potential long-term trends in kelp here in Oregon is what's happened over the past 5 years in Northern California. So in 2013 or 2014, sea star wasting disease hit the Oregon coast. I think we heard Lillian talking about that earlier. Oh, well, not just the Oregon coast, the entire West Coast. And what happened was that in the absence of sea otters, since we don't have any in Northern California, Oregon, in the absence of sea otters, sea stars are one of the main predators of urchins. And so when all the sea stars died, there were no predators left to eat any urchins. And so their populations absolutely exploded, especially purple urchins. And they've documented pretty well in Northern California that has led to dramatically diminished kelp populations all across their northern coast, from down in the San Francisco area all the way up to the Oregon border. And it's been really dramatic, and it's kind of persisted for a couple of years now. We don't have good information about whether that's happened here in Oregon. We have anecdotal evidence that there have been kelp population declines. We certainly know that there have been explosions in urchin populations in some areas here, but I can't say right now whether that trend has happened here in Oregon and whether it's happened as strongly. And so this is an area of research that I'm focusing on in my PhD. I've just started the second year, so I'm still getting resources and momentum together, but so what I want to use is that in Southern California, over the past 10 years or so, they've started using satellite imagery, as I showed you before. You can use this since canopy-forming kelp reach the surface and sit on the surface there, you can see it from space, which is amazing. And they've successfully been using that in Southern California to track giant kelp populations. And since these satellite records go back 30 or 40 years, they've managed to get 30 or 40-year time series of how big kelp populations have been in Southern California. As of yet, this technique hasn't been applied anywhere else, and I'm working with a big aspect of my PhD is I'm working with a collaborator down in Southern California, Dr. Tom Bell, who's one of the authors on that paper, to bring this method and the algorithms that they've used to identify giant kelp in satellite imagery. We're working to train those algorithms so that they can identify bull kelp instead and bring it up here to Oregon and get that 30 or 40-year time series of what kelp has been doing in Oregon. So in some ways, I wish the symposium had been like 2 or 3 months later, because I'm actually going down to Santa Barbara in a couple of weeks to go work with Tom and really hammer out some details on the algorithms and the analysis. And so that should be forthcoming rather soon. And that's an exciting kind of gap in our current understanding of bull kelp that I hope to be able to address in the course of my PhD. So I guess one thing that I do want to stress up here is that, as I mentioned earlier, we know a lot less about bull kelp than some other kelp ecosystems, and a lot more questions remain. We don't really understand how tightly urchins can exert top-down control on kelp populations here, and whether that works similarly here as it does in places like California and Alaska. We don't know how hypoxia, which has become a big problem seasonally in coastal Oregon, might be impacting kelp, or conversely, how kelp might help mitigate local hypoxic conditions. We don't know how strongly rockfish recruitment depends on the kelp forests that we have along the coast of Oregon, or how things like disease, like sea star wasting disease, or a disease that were to target kelp itself, might impact the long-term viability. We don't know how our fisheries, both the urchin fisheries and more indirectly some of the rockfish fisheries, might be impacted by kelp populations. And of course, a question that's always hanging over any ecologist's head these days is, what's climate change going to do? How is climate change going to impact the long-term physiology, population dynamics, and overall sustainability of the ecosystems that these bull kelp forests sustain here in Oregon? So there's a lot left to learn about that. One of the reasons that there has been a lot less work on this, especially in Oregon, is that it's really hard to do subtidal work in Oregon. It is wave exposed, it is cold, it is dark. You cannot go out and dive 300 days a year like they can in Southern California. Again, not better. So traditionally, it's been hard to go out and do the scuba surveys that they've used in other places to get that information about kelp forests. Fortunately, there are some new technologies and some new programs have been emerging that have, in the last 10 years or so, helped us begin to get a better understanding of these nearshore ecosystems. As far as new technologies, one of those is using things like satellite images to gain more information about bull kelp populations. Also, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, over the past 10 years, has been really perfecting the use of ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, that they can send down into the water with little cameras on them and use those to do rocky reef surveys instead of actual divers. And then a third thing to point out in terms of programs is the Marine Reserves Program here in Oregon has finally managed to muster the time, the energy, the money, and the divers to get together a regular subtidal monitoring program for scuba-based subtidal monitoring program for kelp forests and other rocky reef near shore ecosystems. So things are in motion, things are happening, but this, as of now, these kelp forest ecosystems are still largely, our understanding of them is still pretty light, pretty unresolved. So, in conclusions, a few things that I would like to humbly offer to UC Otter experts here as a measly kelp person is that I think we should just keep all this uncertainty in mind, this uncertainty around these ecosystems in mind while we're planning for potential reintroductions. I think a lot of the talks today have outlined just what a special place sea otters hold in coastal ecosystems and coastal food webs. And so keep in mind that if we are reintroducing them into Oregon, we're introducing them into a set of ecosystems that we don't have a very highly resolved idea of how they work, of what their main drivers are, how they interact with each other. So keep that uncertainty in mind. And then the second thing I would like to offer is that this kind of work is really exciting for me to see, because all this energy and enthusiasm that's coming together around sea otters, I think that can also be used to help springboard and encourage new research, not only into sea otters, but into coastal ecosystems as well. Like I said, we are data limited in some ways on the Oregon coast about these systems. And so if we can use these efforts to take kind of a ecosystem-based approach and try to learn more, not just about otters, but also about the ecosystems that they would be a part of were they to be introduced, that's really an exciting horizon for me. So thank you all so much for listening. Thanks to Bob and all the other organizers for putting together a great symposium. I'd like to shout out to a couple of my key key collaborators on my kelp work, and that includes Tom Bell down in Southern California, as well as Dave Fox, who's at ODF&W, and really helped springboard my interest in this work. And then I actually have to go back to Corvallis to go to a class that I have to make today. So I won't be able to stick around too long. So if you have any further questions about this work, or if you would like future updates on some of the kelp work that I'm doing, again, my name is Sara Hamilton. That's my email, and you can also follow me on Twitter. So thank you all so much for listening.